Margaret Hayes, a sharp and spirited 72-year-old, had always valued her independence. After retiring from her career as a high school teacher, she moved to the quiet town of Maplewood, where she bought a charming cottage with a small but beautiful backyard pool. The pool was her pride and joy, a place where she could relax, swim laps for exercise, and enjoy the sunshine. It wasn't just a pool to her. It was her personal retreat. Margaret's neighborhood was a mix of young families and older couples. Most of her neighbors were polite, but she kept to herself, preferring the company of her books and her cat, Whiskers. She wasn't unfriendly, just private. Her days were simple: morning swims, tending to her garden, and evenings spent reading by the poolside. Life was peaceful, and that's exactly how she liked it. But that peace was about to be shattered. It started innocently enough. One warm summer evening, Margaret noticed wet footprints on her patio. She frowned. She hadn't been in the pool that day, and the gardener hadn't come by. Curious, she walked over to the pool and saw that the water level had dropped slightly. A damp towel was draped over her fence, and an empty soda can sat on one of her lounge chairs. Margaret sighed. She wasn't one to jump to conclusions, so she decided to give the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was a harmless mistake, a kid who had wandered in and panicked. She cleaned up the mess and tightened the lock on her gate, hoping it was a one-time thing. But it wasn't. A week later, Margaret was reading in her living room when she heard splashing. At first, she thought it was the pool filter, but then she heard laughter. She set her book down and walked to the back door. Peeking through the curtains, she saw 3 teenagers, 2 boys and a girl, swimming in her pool as if they owned it. One of the boys was doing cannonballs and the girl was lounging on a floaty. Margaret's heart raced. She stepped outside, her voice firm but calm. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" The kids froze. The boy scrambled out of the pool dripping wet while the girl quickly grabbed her sandals. We didn't think you'd mind," the boy stammered. "It's so hot and your pool looks so nice." Margaret crossed her arms. "It's my pool and I do mind. Who are you and where do you live?" The girl mumbled something about living a few houses down before they all bolted out the gate. Margaret stood there, shaking her head. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but this was her home, her space. She decided to talk to their parents. The next day, she knocked on the door of the house the kids had mentioned. A man in his 40s answered, looking annoyed. "Yes?" Margaret explained what had happened, expecting an apology. Instead, the man shrugged. "Oh, come on, they're just kids. It's not like they broke anything." Margaret's jaw tightened. "It's not about breaking anything. It's about respect. This is my property, and I don't appreciate people using it without permission." The man rolled his eyes. "You're being dramatic. It's just a pool." Margaret left feeling frustrated. She installed security cameras the next day, hoping that would deter any future trespassers. For a while it worked, but then, one scorching afternoon, she came home to find her backyard gate wide open, and her pool full of people. Margaret pulled into her driveway after a morning of grocery shopping, her car filled with bags of fresh produce and her favorite tea. As she stepped out, she noticed something odd. Her side gate was slightly ajar. She always kept it locked. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She walked around to the backyard and her heart sank. Her pool was packed with people. Not just a few teenagers this time. Adults, kids, even a dog splashing in the shallow end. Lounge chairs were taken, a folding table was set up with snacks, and someone had brought a portable speaker blasting music. It was a full-blown pool party, and Margaret hadn't been invited to her own home. For a moment, she stood frozen, staring at the scene. Her hands clenched into fists as she scanned the crowd. She recognized a few faces, neighbors from down the street, people she'd never spoken to but had seen around. One woman, a middle-aged blonde named Linda, waved at her like this was some casual get-together. "Hey, Margaret," Linda called out, holding a drink in one hand. "Hope you don't mind. It's so hot today and your pool is just perfect." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Mind? Oh, I mind," she said, her voice sharp and steady. "Every single one of you, get out. Now." Some people froze, looking embarrassed. Others exchanged glances as if Margaret were overreacting. Linda rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't be like that. You weren't even home. It's just a pool." Margaret stepped forward, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "It's not just a pool. It's my pool. My house, my yard. You don't live here. You don't pay for this, so get out, all of you." A man in the pool muttered, "Geez, what's her problem?" That was the last straw. Margaret stormed over to the pool equipment box, grabbed the remote, and shut off the pool filter. The music from the portable speaker cut out as she yanked the power cord. The sudden silence was deafening. "I'm calling the police," she announced, pulling out her phone. That got them moving. Drinks were snatched up, towels were hastily wrapped around waists, and within minutes her yard was empty. Linda, however, had the audacity to glare at Margaret on her way out. "You don't have to be so uptight," she muttered. Nobody was hurting anything. Margaret slammed the gate behind them, locked it, and stood there, hands on her hips, fuming. She knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. They had zero respect for her. And if respect wasn't going to stop them, something else would. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at the security footage from earlier that day. The nerve of these people. The way they acted so entitled, like her property was theirs to use whenever they pleased. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was done. If they wanted to keep treating her pool like the neighborhood water park, she was about to make sure their next visit would be their last. First, she made a trip to the hardware store. She picked up 2 heavy-duty locks, one for the side gate and one for the pool equipment box. The old ones were strong, but these were unbreakable. Next, she went online and ordered a special pool treatment. It wasn't dangerous, but it was highly effective at exposing rule breakers. Pool dye. A harmless chemical that turned the water bright green if someone peed in it. If even one of these freeloaders tried to use her pool again, they'd leave looking like a radioactive alien. But that was just the start. Margaret wanted insurance, something that would make them think twice before ever stepping foot in her yard again. So she went to a local sign shop and had a custom pool sign made. The next morning, she drilled it right onto her fence where everyone could see. Warning: pool chemically treated for unauthorized use. Exposure may cause rash, severe itching, or temporary skin discoloration. Did it sound a little extreme? Sure. Was any of it actually true? Nope. But they didn't know that. And just to sell it, she placed an empty hazardous chemical container near the pool pump, something she'd picked up from a friend who worked in maintenance. Now all she had to do was wait. The next day was hot, the kind of heat that made people desperate for a way to cool off. Margaret sat by her living room window, sipping iced tea and watching the street. She had a clear view of her backyard gate and the new warning sign she'd installed. It was bold, bright, and impossible to miss. It didn't take long for the first test. Around noon, a group of teenagers walked past her fence. They stopped, read the sign, and exchanged nervous glances. One of them pointed at the empty hazardous chemical container near the pool pump. They whispered among themselves, then quickly walked away. Margaret smirked. So far, so good. Later that afternoon, Linda, the woman who had organized the pool party, walked by with her dog. She paused, squinting at the sign. Margaret watched from her window as Linda pulled out her phone and started typing. A few minutes later, Margaret checked the neighborhood Facebook group. Sure enough, there was a post from Linda. FYI, looks like Margaret put some kind of weird chemical in her pool. Says it causes rashes and skin issues. Not sure how safe that is. Just a heads up. OMG, what if it leaks into the ground? That doesn't sound safe. Why does she even care so much? It's just water. She's always been so uptight. Who does that? Margaret chuckled to herself. They were mad. Not because she was lying, not because they got caught, but because they realized their free ride was over. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they'd finally leave her alone. But Margaret wasn't naive. She knew some people wouldn't be deterred by a sign or an empty chemical container. She needed one last layer of protection. That evening, she installed a motion-activated sprinkler system along the fence. If anyone tried to sneak in again, they'd get a nice cold wake-up call. The next day, Margaret was in her garden pruning her roses when she heard the sharp knock on her front door. She wiped her hands on her apron and peeked through the peephole. It was Linda, arms crossed, looking furious. Margaret sighed. Here we go, she thought. She opened the door, keeping her expression calm. Yes? Linda didn't waste any time. We need to talk. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Do we? Linda huffed. Look, I don't know what your problem is, but people are saying you put some kind of dangerous chemicals in your pool. What if a kid touches the water? Do you even care? Margaret folded her arms. I care very much. That's why I put up the sign. To keep out uninvited guests. Linda's jaw clenched. You can't do that. What if someone gets hurt? Margaret tilted her head. Someone who broke into my yard, you mean? Linda faltered. That's not the point. It's exactly the point, Margaret shot back. I told people to stay out, they didn't listen, so I took precautions. Linda scoffed. You're ridiculous. You don't even have kids. It's just sitting there, going to waste. Margaret's eyes narrowed. So because I don't have kids, that means my pool is up for public use? Linda rolled her eyes. Oh, come on, don't act like... Margaret cut her off. No, you come on, Linda. You and the rest of these people have some nerve. You don't pay for my water bill. You don't clean my pool. But you expect to just help yourselves? Linda's face turned red. Well, if you weren't so unfriendly, maybe people would actually like you. Margaret laughed. A deep, genuine laugh. That's your problem, Linda. You think being liked means letting people walk all over you. Linda opened her mouth, closed it, then shook her head in frustration. You know what? Forget it. She turned on her heel and stomped off. Margaret called after her, Enjoy using your own hose this summer. She shut the door, smiling to herself. They were mad, but they had finally gotten the message. A few days passed, and Margaret's backyard remained quiet. No more wet footprints, no more laughter, no more uninvited guests. The warning sign and the motion-activated sprinklers seemed to be doing their job. Margaret allowed herself to relax a little, though she kept a close eye on the security cameras just in case. But then, one sweltering afternoon, Margaret heard the familiar sound of splashing. Her heart sank. She rushed to the window and saw two teenagers, a boy and a girl, climbing over her fence. They hadn't noticed the sprinklers yet. Margaret watched as they approached the pool, whispering to each other. The boy dipped his hand into the water, then pulled it back quickly. Dude, the water feels weird, he said, frowning. The girl shrugged. It's probably fine. Let's just jump in. Margaret didn't wait to see what happened next. She grabbed her phone and marched outside. Excuse me, she called out, her voice sharp and commanding. The kids froze, their eyes wide. We didn't think you'd mind, the boy stammered. Margaret crossed her arms. Really? Did you not see the sign? The girl glanced at the warning sign, then at the empty chemical container. Her face paled. Is that stuff dangerous? Margaret raised an eyebrow. Why don't you find out? The boy grabbed the girl's arm. Come on, let's get out of here. They scrambled back over the fence, leaving their towels behind. Margaret shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. Her plan was working. But the real test came later that evening. Margaret was in her kitchen preparing dinner when she heard the unmistakable sound of her sprinklers activating. She rushed to the window and saw Linda standing at the edge of her yard, drenched from head to toe. Linda's dog was barking, and she was frantically trying to shield herself from the water. Margaret stepped outside, her arms crossed. Can I help you, Linda? Linda glared at her, water dripping from her hair. What is wrong with you? These sprinklers are ridiculous. Margaret shrugged. They're there for a reason. Maybe next time you'll think twice before trespassing. Linda sputtered. I wasn't trespassing, I was just looking for my dog. Margaret glanced at the dog, who was happily rolling in the grass, completely unfazed by the water. Looks like your dog is fine, maybe you should keep him on a leash. Linda's face turned red, but she didn't have a comeback. She grabbed her dog's leash and stormed off, muttering under her breath. Margaret watched her go, feeling a sense of satisfaction. She had tried to be nice, she had given warnings, and she had even asked politely. But some people only understood consequences. The days turned into weeks, and Margaret's backyard remained blissfully quiet. The warning sign, the sprinklers, and the rumors about the dangerous chemicals had done their job. No one dared to trespass again. Margaret finally felt at peace. Her pool was hers again, her backyard was quiet, and the entitlement of her neighbors was gone. She didn't have to call the police or make a scene. She had simply stood her ground and set boundaries. One evening, as she sat by the pool with a cup of tea, she reflected on the whole ordeal. Some people didn't respect boundaries unless they were forced to. Margaret had tried to be nice, but when that didn't work, she had taken matters into her own hands, and it had worked. She wasn't proud of being petty, but she wasn't ashamed either. She had done what she needed to do to protect her home and her peace of mind. And if anyone had a problem with that, well, they could deal with it. As the sun set over Maplewood, Margaret smiled to herself. Life was simple again, just the way she liked it.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.